At exactly 118 hours local time, in the ink-black depths of the Strait of Hormuz, the USS Connecticut, a Seawolf-class nuclear attack submarine, was holding station at 210 feet on a course of 85 degrees, running at a barely perceptible 3.2 knots. Her AN BQQ-10 sonar suite was processing 11,000 individual acoustic signatures simultaneously, the groan of stranded tankers above, the distant pulse of Iranian fast attack craft patrolling the surface, and the steady seismic tremor of a world economy bleeding out one barrel at a time. On the tactical display, the watch officer stared at a faint but repeating anomaly, a 14 Hz vibration resonating from the seafloor at grid coordinates 26.5 degree N, 56.3 degree E. It was not geological, it was mechanical, it was breathing. What the Pentagon would soon codename Depth Zero, Iran's most closely guarded secret beneath the world's most important waterway. 48 hours earlier, the RC-135V Times rivet joint times operating from Al Udeid Air Base had intercepted a hairline fracture in Iran's supposedly sealed fiber-optic command architecture. A routine drone targeting packet intended for a Houthi ballistic launch cell in Sa'ada, Yemen, had arrived corrupted, and in that corruption, U.S. signals analysts at Fort Meade discovered something that turned the blood cold. The packet had not traveled overland through Iran's mountain relay stations. It had been routed through a submerged repeater node sitting on the floor of the Strait of Hormuz, 47 meters below sea level, inside a hardened titanium shell the size of a football field. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency cross-referenced the coordinates against every public and classified seabed survey on record. The structure did not exist on any of them. Iran had laid it in silence during the 2021 to 2023 dredging operations that Tehran had publicly described as routine channel maintenance, the same kind of covert infrastructure placement Iran had mastered since the 1980s tanker war, when they first learned to weaponize the narrow waterway that carries oil from Karg Island and the rest of the Gulf to the global economy. For 3 years, the most consequential piece of command infrastructure in the Middle East had been hiding 47 meters beneath the world's most watched waterway. The Pentagon codenamed it Depth Zero. Depth Zero was not simply a communications relay. NSA analysis of the intercepted packet metadata revealed a layered architecture of terrifying sophistication. The node served as the synchronized trigger controller for 3 simultaneous threat systems. First, real-time targeting data uplinks to Houthi Zulfikar 3 medium-range ballistic missile batteries across northern Yemen, missiles derived from Iran's own QAM design and the same batteries that had fired their opening salvo against Israel just hours earlier, marking the Houthis' first entry into the broader war. Second, the command and arms signal chain for approximately 400 EM-52 rocket-propelled rising mines pre-positioned across the Strait's northern and southern traffic separation schemes, each triggered by ship, magnetic, and acoustic signatures, the same mines currently trapping 2,000 vessels and 20,000 seafarers in the world's most important choke point. Third, and most alarmingly, the intermediate-range ballistic targeting data that had enabled Iran to place 2 missiles within 800 meters of the Diego Garcia runway just 72 hours earlier, a precision at extreme range that American analysts had until now considered impossible without space-based guidance Iran did not openly possess. DEPTH-0 was the answer. It was receiving targeting refinement data from an Iranian constellation of disguised commercial microsatellites and rebroadcasting it to every active launch cell in the theater. Shut down Depth Zero, and Iran loses the precision edge across every front simultaneously. Trigger its dead hand failsafe instead, and the 400 mines arm and detonate autonomously. The Strait of Hormuz becomes a permanent graveyard of steel, and the global economy loses 20% of its daily oil supply in a single heartbeat. CENTCOM had exactly one option in 11 hours to execute it before Depth Zero cycled its authentication codes, making the dead hand protocol impossible to spoof. The order went to SEAL Team 6, DevGrew's Black Squadron, the most capable combat divers on the planet. The mission was designated Operation Iron Tide. 8 operators, 4 combat assault divers, and 4 electronic warfare specialists would be inserted from the USS Connecticut by dry deck shelter in 2 sealed delivery vehicles, the SDV Mark 11 Mod 1. Their objective: physically breach the node's external access hatch, uplink a U.S. Cyber Command override package via a hardwired NSA tap device to neutralize the dead hand before detonating shaped demolition charges against the fiber-optic trunk lines. The margin for error was absolute zero. If the hardwire tap failed to authenticate within 90 seconds of hatch breach, the dead hand protocol would read the loss of signal as a hostile action and arm every mine in the strait. At 130 hours, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, assault lead for Iron Tide, checked his Draeger LAR-5 rebreather one final time in the flooded DDS compartment. The LAR-5 produces 0 bubbles, emitting no acoustic signature detectable by passive sonar. Around him, his 7 operators went through final equipment checks in the total darkness of the submerged shelter. Each man carried a Heckler and Koch MP-5N in an underwater pressure sleeve, a SIG P-226 in a sealed Pelican holster, and most critically, a Type 3 NSA hardwire tap unit, a device no larger than a laptop, built specifically for this mission, capable of injecting a 40 gigabyte Cyber Command override directly into Depth Zero's command processor via its external diagnostic port. The SDVs slipped out of the DDS at 142 hours and descended to the seafloor at cruise depth, navigating by inertial guidance and passive sonar. The strait's floor was a graveyard of anchor chains, discarded fishing gear, and the corroded hulls of vessels sunk in previous conflicts. At 14 kilometers from the node, the SDV's Doppler velocity log registered a new feature on the seabed, a low rectangular structure with metallic resonance, precisely where the Connecticut's sonar had recorded the 14 Hz signature. Simultaneously, 45,000 feet above the strait, 2 EA-18G Growler aircraft from the USS Gerald R. Ford Times had been holding a precise racetrack orbit since 2,300 hours the previous night. Their ALQ-99 jamming pods and next-generation jammer mid-band pods active in receive-only mode. They were not yet transmitting. The Growlers were mapping every active and passive emission from the Iranian coastal air defense network, the Sayad 4B batteries on Keshem Island, the Bavar 373 acquisition radars, and their associated Mirage 4 S-band AESA radar arrays buried in the cliff faces of Hormozgan province. Systems capable of tracking 60 targets simultaneously at ranges up to 320 kilometers, and most critically, any electromagnetic leakage from Depth Zero's external antenna array. At 155 hours, the lead Growler's electronic warfare officer reported the finding to CAOC in Qatar. Depth Zero was pulsing a 2.4 gigahertz maintenance beacon on a 7-minute interval, likely an automated health check being transmitted to an Iranian monitoring station somewhere on the Keshem coastline. If that beacon failed to transmit on schedule during the assault window, the Iranian monitoring station would trigger an emergency authentication challenge. If the node failed to respond within 60 seconds, the dead hand armed automatically. The Growlers had to spoof that beacon with perfect signal fidelity during the entire assault window. 1 millisecond of deviation in pulse timing would be the end. At 211 hours, the SDVs reached Depth Zero. Chief Webb and his partner, Petty Officer First Class Daniel Ortega, left the vehicle and approached the node's outer hull. Up close, the structure was a revelation of engineering ambition. A double-hull titanium composite pressure vessel, approximately 95 meters long and 22 meters wide, resting on a concrete cradle bolted directly into the limestone bedrock of the strait floor. The outer surface was covered in acoustic dampening tiles identical to those used on Russian Yasenem submarines, the same tiles that made the Kazan and Novosibirsk nearly invisible to passive sonar during the Arctic engagement reported by Ukrainian intelligence just days earlier. Along the structure's eastern face, Webb located the external diagnostic access panel, a watertight housing concealing 3 NATO standard Ethernet ports, and a fiber-optic splice junction. This was the doorway. Webb signaled to his electronic warfare specialist, Petty Officer First Class James Calloway, who moved forward with the Type 3 NSA TAP unit. The connection port was exactly where the agency's analysis had predicted. At 214 hours and 37 seconds, Calloway seated the TAP device and activated the hardwire uplink. 90 seconds. The clock was running. Above the waterline, the Growlers made their move. On a precise signal from the USS Connecticut's Times communication system, the lead EA-18G activated its NGJ-MB pod at minimum effective power, transmitting a spoofed copy of Depth Zero's 2.4 GHz maintenance beacon on the exact timing interval. The signal was indistinguishable from the node's own pulse, character perfect down to the individual modulation fingerprint extracted from 3 hours of passive intercepts. On the Iranian monitoring station screen, Depth Zero appeared completely normal. The station had no idea it was listening to an American aircraft 14 kilometers above the strait instead of its own billion-dollar asset on the seabed. On the bottom of the Hormuz, the 90-second countdown was at 61 seconds when the Type 3 TAP unit's status indicator shifted from amber to red. Authentication failure. Depth Zero's internal security processor had rejected the Cyber Command package's cryptographic handshake on the first attempt. Calloway's hands moved immediately, not in panic, but with the mechanical precision of 400 hours of mission rehearsal. The Type 3 carried 3 preloaded authentication packages, each generated from a different exploit vector within Depth Zero's identified architecture. Package 1 had failed. Package 2 was loading. At the USS Connecticut, the communications officer relayed the status to CAOC in a compressed burst transmission lasting 0.8 seconds. CAOC's response was instantaneous. The second Growler, which had been holding in electromagnetic silence throughout the operation, activated its full ALQ-99 suite and began saturating the 400 MHz to 18 GHz spectrum above the strait. If the Iranians detected the sudden spike in electronic noise and triggered any authentication query to Depth Zero, the node's own response system would be fighting through a wall of American jamming just long enough to buy Calloway the time he needed. The 90-second countdown was at 38 seconds when the Type 3 status indicator shifted from red to amber. Package 2 was handshaking. At 22 seconds, the indicator turned green. The Cyber Command override was in. At 216 hours and 1 second, Cyber Command's operator at Fort Meade, Maryland, watching the uplink status in real time, executed the override command. In the processing core of Depth Zero, the dead hand authentication sequence received a spoofed all-clear signal from what it believed was its own internal watchdog timer. The dead hand armed down. Simultaneously, the override package began writing a recursive denial-of-service loop into Depth Zero's primary targeting data processor, not destroying the data, but rendering it unreadable to any uplink request from external receivers. In the Houthi launch control centers across northern Yemen, targeting computers began reporting a loss of refinement data, their ballistic solutions degrading from a circular error probability of 12 meters to over 1,400 meters. In the minefield management subsystem, the EM-52 mine command arm channels went dark one by one, the 400 pre-positioned weapons reverting to safe mode, their acoustic fuses powered down. And on a monitoring screen in an underground bunker on Keshm Island, a red cascade of system fault indicators swept across the display. 47 systems, then 120, then all of them at once. The entire Depth Zero architecture collapsing in controlled sequence under the weight of a cyber intrusion the Iranian operators could see but could not stop, could not trace, and could not reverse. Webb gave the signal. The 4 demolition specialists moved to the node's primary fiber-optic trunk lines, 4 armored conduits running along the bottom of the eastern hull, each carrying 400 gigabits per second of encrypted targeting, command, and telemetry data to the surface. Against the trunk lines, the operators placed linear-shaped charges preformed at a standoff of 15 millimeters, specifically designed to sever the armored cabling without damaging the surrounding seabed infrastructure. Webb squeezed the detonator. The charges fired in a sequence lasting 0.08 seconds. The concussive wave was sharp and short, contained by the dense water to a bubble no larger than a truck. The fiber-optic trunks were severed clean. Depth Zero was now physically blind, digitally neutralized, and structurally intact exactly as intended. A physically destroyed node could have triggered the dead hand through a power interruption. A surgically severed node, with its dead hand already spoofed into safe mode, could not respond to anything at all. The operators were back in the SDVs and moving to recovery depth at 223 hours, 11 minutes after first contact with the structure. The USS Connecticut Times received them at 251 hours and turned southwest at maximum quiet speed. By 400 hours, the effects were cascading across every active front in the theater. The Houthi ballistic command cell in Sadr that had fired at Israel just hours earlier reported a complete loss of targeting refinement. Their remaining Zulfikar 3 batteries, relying now on degraded inertial guidance only, were no longer capable of the precision strikes that had made their first salvo so shocking. The 400 EM-52 mines in the Strait's traffic separation scheme were in safe mode, their acoustic fuses dormant. The USS Bataan Amphibious Ready Group, which had been holding 60 nautical miles south of the Strait for 11 days, received the order to begin the minefield survey operation at first light. Avenger-class minesweepers and MH-53EC Dragon helicopters began systematic clearance operations at dawn. The first mine was recovered by an MH-60S Nighthawk crew at 637 hours. By 1400 hours, naval engineers estimated the northern lane could be reopened within 72 hours. The first commercial vessel, a Pakistani-flagged tanker sailing under the protection agreement negotiated by Islamabad, transited the newly cleared corridor at 15:09 hours local time, the first ship to pass freely through the Strait of Hormuz in 29 days. The Iranian monitoring station on Keshm Island had begun transmitting authentication queries to Depth Zero at 220 hours 1 minute before the fiber-optic trunks were physically cut. When the node failed to respond, the Iranian commander declared a catastrophic systems failure and reached for the emergency manual arming protocol for the mine network. The protocol required a hardwired signal transmitted through a separate coastal cable to an offshore relay buoy. At 224 hours, that relay buoy was no longer in position. The USS Connecticut, on her approach to the DDS recovery point, had cut the relay cable with her TB-29A towed array's passive sensor suite and a precisely targeted deployment of a Mark 67 submarine-launched mobile mine, not to destroy the buoy, but to sever the undersea cable feeding it, leaving the Iranian commander holding a dead receiver. The dead hand had been disarmed in digital space. The manual override had been silenced in the physical world. Depth Zero was simply gone, and no one in the IRGC Navy command structure had the manual authority to rebuild what 3 years and $3.8 billion had created on the seabed of the Hormuz. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had said from Paris just hours earlier that the United States expected to conclude its war objectives in a matter of weeks. On the floor of the Strait of Hormuz, at 47 meters depth, in absolute darkness, 8 men in rebreathers had just made that timetable a credible reality. Iran still has ballistic missiles. It still has dispersed launch cells across the Zagros range. It still has proxy networks from Baghdad to Beirut. But the synchronized nervous system, the precision edge that had made simultaneous multi-theater strikes possible, that had placed 2 missiles within 800 meters of Diego Garcia, that had trapped 2,000 ships and 20,000 seafarers in the world's most critical waterway, that nervous system is now a severed cable on the floor of the Hormuz, cooling in the sediment, hearing nothing and saying nothing forever. Iran's real nightmare tonight is not that America found Depth Zero. It is that America found it, walked inside it, and left without a single Iranian radar knowing they had ever been there. The battle for the Strait was not won on the surface with missiles and aircraft carriers. It was won 47 meters below the surface by 8 men and a 90-second countdown. In the age of the kill web, the most decisive weapons are the ones that never appear on the surface at all. What do you think? Was the decision to neutralize rather than destroy Depth Zero the right call? Could Iran rebuild a second node deeper outside the strait? Comment your strategic assessment below. If this deep dive briefing opened your eyes to how the real war beneath the water is being fought, hit the like button and subscribe, because next time we go inside the USS Connecticut's Times Combat Information Center and show you exactly what the Seawolf class can do that no other submarine on Earth can replicate. The watch continues.